causes that we give to, the memberships that we belong to, that there is a entitlement on the part of some in that generational movement to suggest that those ought to be free. They ought to be givens to the population. Now, while they are indeed very savvy in terms of their technology skills and their use of social media, that has been a factor in why that generation has really defined and shaped how social technologies and social media have really reflected their characteristics and their behaviors. 70% of millennials and Gen Zs secure their news through social media, not through the newspapers, not on television, and not through the channels that we have historically understood as the gateways of learning about the storylines of political, economic, and social development. I think there are some interesting structural realities that we need to come to grips with about looking at the future. We are now, not all of us, but many of us, fourth and fifth generations here in the United States as Jewish Americans. This is increasingly telling us a story from the Pew study of 2013. And by the way, there will be a second Pew report next year. And both of those studies together, I think, will create for us a kind of conversation about generations, and that the distance we are from our historical roots is a storyline that we need to follow. The further away from being an immigrant generation, from being tied to the Holocaust, from being part of the founding of the State of Israel, or being in some measure at the moment of action, because these were extraordinary moments in the 20th century that defined the century itself and created for Jews two core elements in the definitions of their history. The first, of course, the destruction of European Jewry, and the second, the engagement and dream of building and securing a Jewish homeland for the first time in 2,000 years. So some are now beginning to write the question, is this the end of peoplehood and community as we have understood it? If there isn't the continuation of that storyline, then what replaces it? And how do you sustain and maintain the idea of a community and a sense of shared peoplehood? One of the interesting new storylines, and we will talk about several of them tonight, but one of them is the rise of American Orthodoxy. And I have done a good deal of research in particular on Chabad because I find it to be an extraordinary mix of success with the American model of community organizing and a kind of European Jewish ideology and messaging. But American Orthodoxy was given up for dead in the 1950s. In fact, amongst the items raised by Dr. Marcus and Dr. Handlin in 1957 was the notion that Orthodoxy would not be a significant player in the American story. And we have learned in the last 50 years to see that that story has become increasingly important. American Orthodox Jews, while accounting for roughly 10 to 12% of the American population, American Jewish population, account significantly in higher numbers in terms of their youthfulness. In other words, they are the youngest elements in American Jewish life, and their volume of children, generally 4 children per household and as many as 6 or 8, but clearly a reference point for seeing their numbers continue to grow and their influence to be a major factor over the 30 years moving forward. We come to 2020 with actually 2 systems in debate with one another, in collision in a sense with one another. The legacy model and the legacy institutions of American Judaism, which we referenced last evening, but are going to talk about much more extensively at this moment, are those institutions created between 1880 and 1920. And they were the core institutions of the American Jewish experience. Religious denominations, the federated systems of human and social services, the organizations of political advocacy for American Jews, principally the American Jewish Committee, 1906, the Anti-Defamation League, 1913, American Jewish Congress, 1917. As we see these institutions emerge, they represent a particular kind of behavior pattern. They cross generations. Their marketing is appealing across the board to the Jewish sector as a whole. They are built around peer relationships. The networks of interlocking peer relationships is profound. As we see in those institutions, synagogues, JCCs, federations, and national agencies, a very interesting corollary of people of a similar age with close ties to one another, whether because they share the same kinds of allegiances and ideas and institutional loyalties, and that has created this massive network, very important to the success and growth of these institutions. These were the organizations that were the American voice in building Israel and in responding to the Shoah. They are organized around some central principles, including which were two core ideas that developed as these institutions emerged. The first, make out of immigrants Americans. And second, to deal with the notion of crisis in American Jewish life, whether it was the Shoah or the founding of the State of Israel, or bringing Soviet Jews to freedom, or creating a variety of efforts to engage American Jews with Israel over its 70-year history. The interesting behaviors of the legacy organizations is that they are based on dues, on membership and affiliation patterns. And that has been both their strength and may be, as we look at 2020 and moving beyond, a challenge to them in terms of how they will be able to financially and demographically grow their story. The boutique model of Jewish life is something that we began to detect in the mid-1980s. And we have every reason to believe that the 1980s is an important turning point in the American Jewish story. First of all, it is the first time that American Jews begin to question Israel on its policies related to Palestinians and to its neighbors in the Arab world. The War of Peace for Galilee, which is a battle scenario of 1982, creates huge pushback in the United States as to whether this was the right war at the right time against the appropriate enemy. And with it come, for the first time, other attacks on the Israel relationship and story. For example, the Who is a Jew crisis comes to its first round of political debates in the mid-1980s. And what we also would see in the mid-1980s is a increasing awareness that Jews were wanting to express themselves in ways that were not part of the established legacy formula. So we see immediately in the mid-1980s the growth of new voices. So who are these institutions? They are very much specialized. They are single issue. They deal with contemporary themes. They tend to be led by individuals who have a vision for something as an alternative. And the interesting nature of these organizations is that there are now 300 to 400 of them that have developed and have continued to emerge in the periods from 1985 to 2005. And you know these groups. You may be part of many of them. In 1985 alone, we see the formation of Mazon, the Jewish response to hunger. In that same year, we would see the American response to the Republican Party's efforts to grow its base, the Republican Jewish Coalition. We would see the birth of a variety of political groups, including J Street. We would see the evolving and active growth of environmental groups, including Kojel, a response on the part of the Jewish community to the issues of the environment. So these organizations, not based and funded through the legacy tradition of membership and dues, were created as an alternative frame for growing and developing Jewish interests in a singular and individualized fashion. So we see then two models of community that have evolved and that are now both part of the American Jewish experience. I have entitled this revolution the Second American Jewish Revolution. If the early parts of the 1900s, including the birth of the AJC, ADL, the federated system, the reform movement and the conservative movement and others, what we are seeing in the mid-1980s is a kind of second response to that, an effort to create another view of how to be an American and how to be Jewish in America. And that would be the response of the growth and development of the boutique movement. I think amongst the questions Jews have asked over these years and continue to ask, even as we debated and discussed this morning the issues of our relationship to Israel in a 20th century and 21st century context, the engagement question with Israel is taking on these multiplicity of voices of people with varying opinions about diaspora-Israel relationships and about Israel's responsibility in return to be responsive to global Jewish interests. I think that the question we have to pose here is the last one on this particular slide. What will Judaism represent to the next generation? If we are seeing, in a sense, this implosion of institutional practice and change, and we are seeing people articulating individualized ways by which they are participating or identifying, so what will that do to the sort of core element and the collective will of the Jewish people? A question that we will want to keep in mind as we move forward in our conversation this evening. Let's take a look at a few factors between now and 2050 that I think will be important and that we can already classify and define. The first of these is on the larger side of the spectrum, that the white sort of majority culture of America, which has been its dominant message and social framework, will disappear within the next 20 to 30 years, as the white majority is replaced by a variety of minority communities that will become the majority cultures, as Latinos, Asian Americans, African Americans assume their role in the American story in more complete ways. And I would point out that Islam, by the way, is the world's fastest growing religion. And it will replace Judaism in the United States over these next 30 years. In fact, demographers say 2043 is the exact date that this will occur. But Islam is clearly going to be the third in the sort of tripartite American religious story. We historically spoke about Catholic, Protestant, and Jew. We will now either have to add in the American Muslim story or replace us with Islam as the third major religion. Something particularly interesting is happening in the economic classes of the United States. The middle class, which was the dominant and clearly the driving engine of the American economy, is disappearing. We have seen the diminution of the middle class already for some periods of time, but it is today no longer the majority of Americans as it slips below 50%. And that will be the challenge of this country, with a very wealthy cohort, as well as a significant poverty base. How will the nation sort of envision and manage its future? The United States is aging, as is much of the European world and Japan. And these parts of the international community that are aging are reflected here in the American story, where, as you can see, just 10 years ago, only 13% of our population were 65 and over. And here in 2020, the nation's population demonstrates a doubling an almost doubling of those numbers. But far more revealing is the Jewish piece to that, and I would add that in here, that American Jews are amongst the oldest of the white ethnic and religious communities in the United States. 25% of American Jews are of age 65 or over. So I think that has become and is an important understanding that we are not replacing ourselves. And as a result, the capacity of institutions to survive is dependent in part on numbers. So I introduce these particular agendas to point out the changing demographics of the country and the implications of that for institutions, Jewish and non-Jewish as well. The last factor on this slide is the trust factor. Every study we are looking at about American attitudes towards government, in particular the Congress and the White House and other institutions of authority, including American religion, have slipped over the years. A loss of confidence in the leadership and in the institutions themselves. And that, in my mind, is particularly problematic in understanding the capacity of the nation to be able to believe in its leadership and have confidence in outcomes that will be beneficial to the society. And that is significantly troubling for a minority community, and I will come back to that in the course of our conversation. Inside the Jewish world, I think we are living with three major challenges. The last one, of course, aging and declining numbers, we have already addressed, but the other two are particularly significant here. We are a siloed and divided society. We know this because Republican Jews and Democratic Jews are in disagreement across the board on issues of Israel, Donald Trump, and other issues. And some would describe us as global Jews who have a kind of progressive universal view of the world, and others would suggest that tribal Jews reflect the self-interests of the community and argue for the perpetuation and welfare and security of Jewish concerns as the first and basic interests of the community. In many ways, the moments we are living in at this time have exacerbated and driven these tensions and divisions deeply. And I referenced that this morning in our conversation around Israel, and I can reference it here in our conversations about understanding the Jewish future and the very different views that we Jews have about the future and about America itself in terms of that future. And that will be a driving issue for millennials and Generation Z in thinking about their place and their views in connection with the society and the Jewish people. I think there are certainly a number of challenges that are both internal to the community, but also beyond it. And certainly, as we have addressed last evening, anti-Semitism and international terrorism must be seen as of principal concern. We have no way of determining whether the spike we are seeing today in anti-Semitism will continue through much or all of this period moving forward. Our hope and anticipation is that it will certainly diminish. And we can work on that principle because we have lived with, in the United States, cycles of hate. We have seen it in the history of the United States with other groups, and certainly in our interest here of understanding it in connection with concerns against Jews, there are similar patterns. International terrorism is a much more difficult proposition because there is simply no way to measure the behaviors and decisions of terrorists in terms of targets and areas of interest. We have seen the rise and the fall of various international movements designed to commit acts of terror, but we simply are not able to fully control and contain their behaviors. This then is the longer term question of whether the future will be driven by a diminishing of hate and of prejudice in the world, or whether it will be maxed by various events and activities that will generate more of these issues. The Jewish role in the world has also changed. And as we described last night when we talked about whiteness as a measure, Jews are no longer see themselves, nor are they seen as the victims of history. They are, in many ways, as Jonathan Sarna and others have suggested, the definers of history. They are changing not only their image, but they are playing roles in American life that really transcend anything that Jews have ever been able to achieve. I would just give you a couple of specific examples of this phenomenal change. In the 2016 presidential campaign, the top 5 donors to Hillary Clinton's campaign were American Jews. In Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, 7 of his top 17 donors were Jewish Americans. Simply to point out the changing perspectives of where Jews sit in the American story as not simply petitioners of influence, but actually creators of power and influence. Another such example of this is the vast changes that we see in the Congress of the United States as an example. In the 116th Congress, the current Congress, there are 36 Jews in the House, and in the United States Senate this time around, there are 9 senators from our community. So this is a very different America than we would see in its earlier forms, and the role that Jews are playing is clearly has been differentiated. The third item here is based on demographic studies from Baltimore and New York and even in Los Angeles, dealing with what I guess we would call the Jewish poor. There is an increasing concern that as the Jewish community in so many ways has advanced itself financially, programmatically, politically, economically, that it is also leaving behind a core base of underprivileged or less capable families of achieving their objectives. We see the Jewish poor factor in several categories. The first are the elderly, especially those who have been living on or have access to limited pensions. Second are some very young folks who are struggling as a result of getting launched in their careers. And we're going to come back to that because that is a particularly important indicator of what may lie ahead. And a third class of folks who are Orthodox, but mostly Haredi, meaning traditional ultra-Orthodox Jews. And a study out of New York suggesting that 45% of the Haredi Jews of New York are living at or below the poverty line. So that gives us an insight into a major challenge for our community. I think that what we are living through at this very moment will also be a fundamental player in the reshaping and thinking of Jewish life. And in particular, I am concerned with the following. First of all, we believe that the element of poverty and food insecurity and unemployment will not only be leaving its mark in other parts of the American economy, but also within the Jewish community itself. And this certainly is of immediate concern. The second factor is that a number of the institutions of the Jewish community have already indicated that they will not be in a good position moving forward. We've seen this even within our own movement with the URJ's announcement last week that it would not open its camps this summer. And this week, the announcement that it was laying off 20% of its personnel. And yesterday, in a story in the Jewish Forward, where Rabbi Jacobs has indicated that this is an existential crisis for the movement and for the union in terms of its very future. In that article, I am quoted as suggesting that this may be the moment that we will begin to see the reshaping of American Jewish institutional life in terms of the mergers, the closures, and the changes that may be necessary financially to allow for institutions to find new ways to partner with other groups in the Jewish world in order to survive. So I do believe that the virus, its impact is longstanding, will have profound effects on shaping individual lives as it will the collective life of the Jewish community. I think that what we need to look at are the changes already happening and that will be significant moving forward. What we are doing at this very moment, virtual Judaism, if you wish, is going to be significantly important as a part of the Jewish story well beyond these days, weeks, and months. I also think that we are seeing a good deal of the privatization of Judaism, meaning you can rent a rabbi. It also implies the notion that being part of denominations may no longer be particularly relevant for many Jews, and therefore this individualized behavior in terms of religious and Jewish expression and participation. I think that we are seeing those signals, and those will undoubtedly be important in the years ahead. What we've described earlier in this presentation about the boutique institutions is really expressed here in this explosion of choice, because what has happened in American life in general and in American religion in particular is the continuation of options where one can find institutions to fit one's particular and core values, ideas, and needs. And that is going to be a continued reality as the Jewish community shifts and changes as we move forward. The Jewish entrepreneurial class, which is the class of those who are extraordinarily wealthy and have emerged in the past 20 years to become really the Jewish funders, because what we have seen happening from the mid-1980s forward is the rise of the family foundations and the growth of America's community foundations. The fastest growing part of Jewish giving is now being generated by these large family foundations, and they are increasingly going to replace the federation system in terms of being the more dominant voice in making gifts of significant size and impact. I would remind you that in the course of the coronavirus, the 8 major Jewish family foundations have come together to create a $80 million fund to assist immediately in the needs of families, institutions, and communities as we move through these difficult periods. I think it would be a mistake for us to believe that what we are seeing now in terms of some of these threats to institutions in terms of their finances and potential mergers and closures is something that happened only in the last 2 months. In fact, the work that I have been particularly interested in has been about 2008. And the economic recession and crisis of 2008, 12 years ago, is driving much of the behaviors and is a carryover to many of the things we are now seeing as a result of COVID-19. So that the downsizing, for example, of the Union for Reform Judaism's infrastructure began in 2008. And what we are seeing at this moment is simply the continuation of that particular pattern. And we see that in the United Synagogue for Conservative Judaism as well. We can document it in the federation systems, and we have seen it across the board with various other institutions in the Jewish world. The other interesting piece to this is that in the midst of this explosion of individuality and privatization and the growth of new funders has also been a culture of experimentation. Part of that is driven by the fact that we are going through such economic and demographic changes that institutions are looking for ways to experiment. And what we are doing tonight through this virtual class is one of those kinds of experiments. And let me give you an early report. Gallup and Pew last week reported that religious activism, that is the rise of interest in American religion since the coronavirus, has jumped 24%. And their view is that virtual religion in America has and may be an interesting glue, an interesting way of salvaging what otherwise may have been the continuous slide of American religion, and that Protestants, Catholics, Jews, and others are finding through this virtual community ways of reaching larger audiences and regaining a sense of credibility and community at a time when people are looking for something whole and relational. So I think that this is an important outcome to our particular story at this moment. So here we are. Stephen Windmueller, who will not be around in 2050, can probably now say many of the things that he believes, not having to sort of live by his message. He may die by it, but he does not have to live by it. So here's what I would suggest. I do see a decline in denominational Judaism, and clearly there are changes in our legacy institutions across the board. And that does not describe the death knell of either of these forces, but it does speak to the radical redistribution of where power, money, and authority may be lying as we move forward. I think that we are also talking about certainly how technology and social media will be the new branding by which Jewish communities and others will be able to frame their case and their messaging. The issue, however, will be a community as we know it may not exist, or it will exist in a multiplicity of other ways. The idea of a shared sense of obligation to the Jewish people does not drive Generation Z supporters or millennials. It is not their message, and it is certainly not their base of thinking. I do believe, however, that we will see the redistribution of Jews around the globe as we have always seen, because as the economies of the world shift and as the power of these economies change, Jews are attracted to opportunity and have always moved with those choices. And I think that will be actually the 21st century's most interesting and major story as we ultimately regain the global model of interactive relationships between nations and economies. Yes, there will be new threats, but Israel is an extraordinarily resourceful and has the great capacity to be able to defend its interests and itself. So I am actually less concerned in the long term that Israel's sort of existence will be challenged, and more that there will be the possibility for it to assert its more permanent place in regional politics and in Middle East economic affairs. I do, however, believe that the diaspora-Israel tensions, at least in the short term, will continue to be challenging. But in the longer term, as with the Second Temple story, the Jews of the Second Temple, having fled ultimately with the destruction of the temple, was always the debate and the questioning about loyalty to Jerusalem and being in diaspora communities. So these tensions and relationships are as old as the history of the Jewish people. So I am less worried that in the long term, while we will have moments of grave disagreements, I think that we will ultimately see commonalities around a number of shared concerns. This eighth issue, the golden age of American Jewry, I think we have lived it. And I think we lived it in the 20th century, and it was an extraordinary story. And we can talk about why the 20th century as against here in the 21st century. But it was truly the full engagement and capacity of the American Jewish community to flourish in the period 1948, moving forward. I think that the American Jewish story is unique, and I have written on this idea of the Jewish contract with America. I believe that we have an extraordinary past, which is why the future has better possibilities than possibly others would suggest. I think that the strength of that story is built around the fact that there is no state-sponsored anti-Semitism, that there is an overwhelming respect for Jews in America, and there is an abiding passion and interest in the state of Israel. Every study conducted by all of the key pollsters about the state of Israel and how it is perceived and received in the United States has very strong numbers. So we must remember that against the backlash of the BDS movement and other forms of anti-Israel expression. This extraordinary base of good feeling is an essential piece to the American Jewish success story as well. The American Jewish enterprise is at least a $10 billion industry. And I say that because economists have tried to put a number around what is the value added of the American Jewish story, of its day schools, its hospitals, its federated institutions, its synagogue denominational organizations, its JCC systems, its camping systems, its Israel American organizations, and the array of all types of other expressions of Jewish life within the world of American Orthodoxy, conservative Judaism, and Reform, along with the development of many secular expressions. This is an extraordinary story. And the story is that it is the second largest religious enterprise in the United States. Outside of the Catholic Church, there is nothing like this experience as the American Jewish scenario. So we have to understand that this plays a significant role in the development of the nonprofit sector and of the capacity of Jews to touch the lives not only of Jews, but of Americans in general as a result of this extraordinary base of institutional development. For a community to have a future, it will require leadership. It will need institutions that have networks that reach amongst themselves and out to others. It must have a vision and a shared agenda. And it must have the creative voices that always allow for growth and change. I think those are the four ingredients for the Jewish future. Will the leadership be accessible and visible to key decision makers in the United States and beyond? And will its institutions have those kinds of networks and credibilities that are essential for it to be seen as a significant player in the American nonprofit world? And are we able to find and build a shared and common agenda? And certainly creativity is the framework by which communities flourish or die. And that, I think, is an essential piece to any kind of visioning for the future. Finally, in preparing for the future, I think, yes, we will move more to the personal, away from the collective, but we need to be planning for leadership and promoting followership. That is not something that just happens. It is something that institutions and leaders need to continue to invest and create. And yes, I think the virtual world will be the significant avenue for so much of our story. And I also believe that we will live through a period of chaos and experimentation. But I hold to the view that chaos is actually creativity, that it allows for the uprooting of things that may no longer be relevant and allow for the blossoming of really new voices and new ideas that are essential. So the bottom line for 2050, I believe that it's a story that has a great promise. I think we may want to memorialize the past, but certainly I think we want to remain very much connected and engaged with our society as we move into the future. And I think that this is a unique moment in time. And in many ways, we will be seeing the new reality in part out of the events happening at this very moment that will be the basis for how we will shape and drive the Jewish future. The coronavirus will have its own impact on America as it will on the Jewish story. And the interesting question will be this rise and pop in religious interest. Will that continue to grow or will it diminish? And the American story on religion has been fascinating because there have been religious revivals in America throughout its history. In the 1830s and again in the 1870s, the Reform movement grows out of the 1870 religious revivalism. So it is a natural story to tell that there is very likely to be yet another moment of religious engagement. And by the way, the success of the 1940s and 50s and the actual birth of your synagogue, Beth Or, comes in the 50s, precisely at the moment of the third American religious revival. The growth of suburbia, the role of American religion would be central. And so Beth Or is one of the expressions of that period of religious revivalism and suburban growth. And yes, in the article that I was interviewed about Jewish life in 2050, it is true, I did say Jews would be living on Mars in 2050. Thank you very much.
Well, my goodness, Dr. Windmueller, you might not be a prophet nor the son of the prophet, but you have certainly given us a number of vantage points with which to look into the future. I thank you again so very much. We will turn to our questions here in just a moment. I want to remind people that in a moment when we conclude our presentation time and our Q&A, we will share with our cantor in Havdalah. As the sun is beginning to set, we will bring an end to our Shabbaton and our Shabbat with our ceremony of separation. Following that, we have a survey. I neglected to open up the survey at the end of our morning session. So we have rephrased some of the questions and would welcome your input regarding the entire Shabbaton, Friday night, Saturday morning, and Saturday afternoon discussion. So turning now to our questions that we have. A question about self-promotion of Judaism as we enter this new time of uncertainty. We at various times in history have been, out promulgating Jewish teachings, Jewish values, what Judaism stands for, what Judaism means. One of our attendees was wondering about how you might see Reform Judaism becoming more proactive in getting its message out there, how we might go about doing that, and how effective do you think that might be?
I think that's actually an interesting issue in the vantage point that we are all Jews by choice. I mean, today we make choices about where we hold our convictions, our beliefs, and our values. And I think, therefore, it is legitimate to suggest that religion is at the stage where it, and certainly Reform Judaism, where it has almost an obligation to suggest that it has a message and a voice that should compete and be heard um, in a time when people may be looking for some new connection or new way of expressing both their religious values and their social conscience, their social justice concerns. So I am of the mind that this idea of self-promotion or religious engagement with others is certainly permissible and ought to be explored.
Terrific. You spent a lot of time talking about some of the challenges that the Jewish communities are facing with regards to, building deeper collaboration and indeed addressing the unfolding demographics that are yet to materialize, the loss of the middle class, the increase of the Jewish poor. Shifting gears a little bit, one of our attendees was wondering, what might you see happening within our political system? Currently, the United States is one of the only, two-party democratic systems. Everyone else is a parliamentary system. Mm-hmm. Do you foresee any kind of change with regards to that two-party system in the future?
I mean, I actually think that we are increasingly moving to a multi-party conversation. Part of that is the divide that we already see in both parties, especially now in the Democratic Party, and that may well trigger the necessity of having more political choices for Americans. And I think likewise on the Republican side, you have a significant number of, and I'm going to look at this first from a Jewish perspective, the Jewish Republicans who account for about 24 to 31% of the Jewish voting cohort. And I range that based on a number of studies rather than to suggest that any one study is correct in defining Republican Jewish voting. Huge numbers of Jewish Republican voters will tell you and have told pollsters that they are very deeply libertarian in their economic philosophy, but don't see a home necessarily in the Republican Party. So it is not surprising that in 2016, significant numbers of Jewish Republican voters moved from the Republican Party to the Libertarian Party, even though obviously that was not ever a question that the party would be in the contest, but it was a statement of their unhappiness, if you wish, with choices available to them. And by the way, on the Democratic side, we should, for equal opportunity, make note that the Brandeis University study of Jewish millennials and their voting behavior in 2016, we believe from the study, 8 to 10% of Jewish millennials did not vote in 2016. Now, for Jewish voters not to vote is really a news story. And the reason this occurred is that these were Bernie supporters. And Bernie wasn't on the ticket in November of 2016, so they simply sat home. And that is a storyline itself that is important, because will that be repeated, for example, in 2020? And the other more interesting piece to this, by the way, is that Jewish voters, the fastest growing part of the Jewish voting scene, are Jews becoming independent, neither Republican or Democratic, almost to tell you that they're not feeling, or voters in general may not be feeling, that the parties are necessarily reflective of their passions or interests or priorities. So I am of the mind that we are likely to see the splintering of the American political scene with some additional parties emerging.
Terrific, wonderful. Absolutely. We have a lot of questions that would deal with, providing, absolute solutions for us in this time of trying to build things on these shifting sands. the Pulitzer Prize winning and indeed Nobel Prize winning answers, how to engage our adult children in Judaism, how to reformat the Jewish movement so they become more vibrant and more enticing. Questions that would take yet another presentation or several to get into. So we will hold those questions for a future time, Dr. Windmueller. I want to thank you again for inspiring us and enlightening us over the course of our sessions, beginning with the tragic reality of anti-Semitism and how it continues to be a festering plague, albeit in smaller numbers, but still reaching far and wide in some very devastating ways, helping us to re-envision how our relationship with Israel and ways in which we can continue to connect with Israel. And then again this evening, taking a look into the crystal ball and trying to envision the future. I am reminded of Moses in the book of Numbers, who after 38 years of wandering has come back to the exact same place. And with the death of Miriam, the children of Israel complain about lack of water. God tells Moses to speak to the rock this time, whereas 38 years earlier, he was told to strike the rock. And Moses was unable to shift his plan of action. And instead of speaking to the rock, struck the rock, lost his patience. A reminder that whenever we try to gaze into the future, we need to realize how our past solutions have worked to a degree, but to simply implement what worked in the past in the future is never going to be a viable solution. Moses could not get into the promised land. He had lost the ability to lead the people, relying on what worked in the past. And I think that's our biggest challenge, is understanding that we have tools that have worked for us in the past, and how do we adapt them to the modern challenges that we are facing. You have, Dr. Windmueller, you have given us some insights as to what we can do, how we can begin to build on our past successes, but also realize that there's so many new things that are coming at us that we have to be creative, we have to be flexible, and we have to always be looking at where our cheese is being moved to in the future, if I may mix analogies. And so again, I thank you tremendously from the bottom of my heart for being a part of us and for stimulating us. I am grateful to Stuart Williger and the funding of our Sylvia Williger Shabbaton speakers. I am grateful to our adult education chairs, Victoria Jacobs and Joyce Kessler and their committee and all of their hard work. Our cantor is getting the guitar ready. I'm going to go grab the Havdalah set. I tell you what, I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll now. If you would please take a moment. And if you would, we've got some questions we would love for you to answer. If you would all take a look at those answers and questions rather, and give us the answers while we get Havdalah set up here. And Joyce and Victoria and Stuart, I will unmute you if you would like to say anything as well, and I will stop spotlighting me. There we go.
Well, I want to thank everyone for their patience. I know we had a couple of technical glitches when we got started, and I think everyone survived those with good humor. And we hope that this is something that we can continue in the future, not just with the Shabbaton, but with other events that we have at Temple Beth Or, so that we allow more people to share, family members elsewhere in the country, not just for Friday night services, but for many of our other activities. We now can have a larger group participate, whether or not they're able to leave their residence and come and join us at the temple.
I would like to just add pretty much the same as what Victoria has said. I would like to thank the committee members again from the bottom of our hearts for all of your support, all of your flying by the seat of our pants, all the changes that you adjusted to so willingly, without complaining, and without your cooperation and your support, all of these programs would not have been available. And Victoria and I thank you.
How many people on the call?
Last night, Dr. Windmueller, after talking about external threats to the Jewish community, postulated that maybe we would have trouble sleeping. Now I don't know if I'm going to have trouble sleeping from the internal self threats, but I've been up since 6 o'clock your time studying Torah, because our local my local congregation has a 9 o'clock Saturday Torah study. So I think I'll just fall asleep and hope it better in the morning.
Okay. Excellent, Stuart. Thank you for bearing with us on the time change. Wonderful, excellent. We are going to continue with our ceremony of Havdalah. We will begin with our blessings. And I am honored to be joined by our cantor, Ariel Goldfarb, who, yes, is my daughter. And all of her musical talents comes from her mother. And I am grateful for the opportunity to share the pulpit with such a creative and energetic and musically talented young woman, if I might say so myself. And with that, we begin Havdalah. We give thanks to the one who makes distinctions, teaching us to transform the commonplace into the holy, creating light and darkness, Israel and the nations, the seventh day of rest, and the 6 days of labor.
Mavdil ben Kodesh lechol, Chatoteinu hu yimchol, Zarenu v'chasfenu yarbech achol, V'cha kochavim balayla. Shavuot Tov, that's not the right one, Zion. Shavuot Tov, 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 a good week, a week of peace. Make gladness reign and joy increase. A good week, a week of peace. Make gladness reign and joy increase. Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishri, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hanavi, Bimhera v'yameinu, Yavo Eleinu, Im Mashiach ben David, Im Mashiach ben David, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hakimati.
With that, we bring our Havdalah ceremony to a close. We bring our Shabbaton to a close as well. Again, Dr. Windmueller, on behalf of Temple Beth Or and all of our attendees, both those virtual and those in physical presence, we are grateful for your inspirational words during our weekend.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any final parting words? Joyce, Victoria, Stuart?
No, it's been a wonderful ride.
Yes, thank you again, Dr. Windmueller, for being so flexible, for the many, many changes we had in this. You were a great person to work with. We really enjoyed that. We hope everyone has a good rest tonight and a wonderful week.
Absolutely, indeed. And if I might say, maybe we will try the trick of King Saul, who held a seance and brought Samuel up. Maybe when 2050 rolls around,
Some of us will be on the way to Mars.
Never know.
So you're about to go there.
we'll be able to let you know how your predictions turned out, Dr. Windmueller. On behalf of everyone, thank you very much for being with us once again. Shabbat, actually, not Shabbat Shalom. Shavua Tov, everyone. Here's to it.
So
Thank you all.
Be safe.
Good night.
Good night.